Captain Sarah Chen stared in stunned silence at the creature before her. Where Princess Zarathek had stood moments before, now crouched something that looked disturbingly familiar. The midnight blue skin remained, as did the impressive height, but the face that looked back at her was unmistakably humanoid. Not just humanoid, it was human in every detail that mattered. The bone structure, the placement of eyes, nose, and mouth, even the way the princess's expression shifted from nervous anticipation to careful observation, it was as if Sarah was looking at a human woman who had been painted blue and given an extra set of arms.
"This is impossible," Sarah whispered, taking an involuntary step backward.
Princess Zarathek's four hands moved in what Sarah now recognized as a distinctly human gesture, wrapping her arms around herself in a defensive posture. You see why we hide behind the ceremonial masks and veils. Why our diplomatic corps never appears without full coverage. The resemblance is troubling. Sarah's scientific mind raced through the implications. Convergent evolution could explain some similarities between species, but not this level of detail. The princess even had human-like teeth, human-like fingernails, and when she breathed, Sarah could see the rise and fall of her chest in exactly the same rhythm as a human's. "How long has your species hidden this?" Sarah asked, moving to the room's central table where her tablet lay. She needed to document this, to record everything. "Since we first encountered humans 300 cycles ago," Zarathek replied. "When your species was still confined to your birth world, we watched from the outer system. Our xenobiologists were disturbed by what they observed." The princess moved with fluid grace to the viewing portal, gazing out at the starfield beyond. Her forearms allowed her to maintain perfect balance while gesturing, and Sarah noticed that even her posture was human-like, confident, regal, but with an underlying tension. At first we assumed it was mere coincidence. Parallel evolution on similar worlds might produce analogous forms. But when our deep space reconnaissance ships began monitoring your radio transmissions, analyzing your cultural development, studying your genetic markers through atmospheric sampling, she paused, turning back to Sarah with an expression of profound unease. "We discovered something that terrified the hegemony's greatest minds." Sarah activated her recording device, knowing that this conversation would reshape humanity's understanding of its place in the galaxy. "What did you discover?"
"Your species wasn't just similar to ours in appearance, Captain Chen."
"Your development patterns matched our own historical records with frightening accuracy. Your technological progression, your social structures, even your artistic expressions, they followed the same pathways our civilization had taken millennia ago." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You're saying our species are related?" "Worse than related," Zarathek replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We believe humanity is what my people were before we underwent the Great Transformation." Sarah felt the deck seem to shift beneath her feet. The Great Transformation was legendary throughout the galaxy. The mysterious process by which the primitive Keth Mori had supposedly evolved overnight from a barely spacefaring civilization to the dominant force in their region of space. "That's impossible. The Keth Mori Empire is over 50,000 years old. Humans have only had recorded civilization for a few thousand years. Time flows differently when you manipulate it, Captain." Zarathek moved back to the table, her four hands working independently to call up holographic displays from her own device. "What I'm about to show you is classified at the highest levels of the hegemony. Knowledge that could start wars or end them." The hologram that materialized between them showed a star chart Sarah didn't recognize. Systems were marked in the flowing script of the Keth Mori language, but as her translation implant processed the text, familiar names began appearing. Sol, Alpha Centauri, Wolf 359. "This is impossible," Sarah breathed. "These are human systems, but according to this chart, they're marked as Keth Mori territory from 50,000 years ago. Not territory, Captain. Origin points." Zarathek manipulated the display, and Sarah watched as the chart zoomed in on the Sol system. "This is where the Great Transformation began. This is where my people, the original Keth Mori, lived before they became what we are today." The holographic Earth rotated slowly, but it looked different. The continents were in familiar positions, but the planet's surface was marked with structures Sarah had never seen in any archaeological survey. "You're telling me that the Keth Mori originally came from Earth?" "No, Captain Chen. I'm telling you that we never left." Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process this information. "But humans are native to Earth. We evolved there." "The fossil record proves it." "The fossil record shows what remains after temporal manipulation, genetic restructuring, and careful historical editing. Zarathek replied, "My people discovered the secrets of time itself 50,000 years ago. When they realized what they could become with the proper modifications, they made a choice that would echo through eternity." The princess gestured to another section of the hologram, and Sarah saw something that made her stomach turn. It was a timeline, but not a linear one. It folded back on itself, creating loops and paradoxes that hurt to contemplate. "They went back, Captain. They changed history itself. The Kethmori you know today, my current form, this is what humans become when they unlock their full potential and decide to rule the galaxy." Sarah slumped into her chair, the weight of this revelation crushing down on her. "So humanity is just, what, an earlier version of your species?" "Not exactly." Zarathik's expression became even more troubled. "You see, the temporal manipulation wasn't perfect. When my ancestors changed history, they created a paradox. Humanity should have ceased to exist once the timeline was altered. But instead, you continued to develop along the original path. I don't understand. There are now two versions of the same species existing simultaneously. The Kethmori, who represent what humans became when they chose the path of dominion and transformation. And humanity, which represents what my people were before they made that choice." Sarah looked up at the princess, beginning to understand the magnitude of what she was hearing. "That's why the Galactic Council fears us. Not because we're aggressive or expansionist, but because we're proof that your empire's foundations are built on a lie. Worse than that, Captain, you're proof that the Great Transformation can be undone." The room fell silent, except for the gentle hum of the ship's systems. Sarah stared at the holographic display, watching the twisted timeline loop back on itself like a snake devouring its own tail. "The hegemony scientists have been studying humanity for 3 centuries, Zarathek continued. "They've been waiting to see which path your species will choose. Will you follow the route to becoming like us, powerful, advanced, but ultimately isolated and feared throughout the galaxy, or will you find a different way? And what do you think we'll choose?" The princess moved closer, her 4 arms gesturing in what Sarah was beginning to recognize as excitement, a distinctly human emotion. "That's what terrifies and thrills me about your species, Captain Chen. Every projection, every model our greatest minds have developed, all point to the same conclusion. Which is? Humanity will surpass us. You'll find the path we missed, the choice we never considered. And when you do, you'll either become our salvation." She paused, her blue face taking on an expression Sarah had never seen before, hope mixed with terror. "Or our extinction." The implications of Princess Zarathek's words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah found herself thinking of every interaction humanity had ever had with the Kethmori, the condescending attitudes, the barely concealed contempt, the way they treated humans as amusing primitives who had somehow stumbled into spaceflight. All of it now made terrible sense. "How many others know about this?" Sarah asked. "Within the hegemony, perhaps 1,000 individuals at the highest levels. The Galactic Council? They suspect, but they don't have proof. Your own species?" Zarathek's expression became almost apologetic. "You're the first human to learn the truth." Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing to the viewing portal. The stars looked different now. Not like distant lights marking territories and civilizations, but like witnesses to a cosmic lie that had persisted for millennia. "Why tell me this? Why risk everything to reveal this secret?" "Because the timeline is accelerating, Captain Chen. Our scientists have detected temporal distortions throughout this region of space. The paradox that allowed both our species to exist is becoming unstable." Sarah turned back to face the princess. "What does that mean?" "It means that within the next few years, perhaps decades, reality itself will force a resolution. Either humanity will take the path to becoming like us, cementing the original timeline and ensuring our continued existence, or you'll find another way, and the Kethmori will cease to have ever existed. 50,000 years of history will unravel, and the galaxy will become something entirely different." The weight of this responsibility was staggering. Sarah felt as though the fate of not just humanity, but potentially dozens of civilizations, was suddenly resting on her shoulders. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked, recognizing the look of someone holding back crucial information. Zarathek nodded slowly. "The temporal distortions aren't natural, Captain. Someone, or something, is actively trying to force the timeline to collapse. We believe there's a faction within both our species that wants to trigger the resolution. To what end? Among my people, there are those who believe that humanity's continued existence is an abomination that weakens the fabric of reality. They want to eliminate your species and stabilize the timeline with the Kethmori as the sole inheritors of this evolutionary path. Sarah felt her blood run cold. And among humans? We're not certain, but our intelligence suggests there are human factions that have discovered fragments of this truth. They may be working to accelerate humanity's development, believing that by rapidly advancing your species, they can force the transformation and claim the power of the Kethmori. Both sides playing with forces they don't understand. Exactly. And the result will be catastrophic regardless of which faction succeeds. Sarah moved back to the table, looking at the holographic timeline with new understanding. The loops and paradoxes weren't just abstract representations. They were actual distortions in the fabric of space-time, and they were growing more unstable with each passing day. What do you want me to do with this information? Princess Zarathek's four hands moved in complex patterns, and the hologram shifted to show a new image, a space station unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. It seemed to exist partially outside normal space, its structure incorporating elements that hurt to look at directly. This is the Nexus Station. It's hidden in a pocket dimension between our two timelines. My ancestors built it as a safeguard during the original temporal manipulation, a place where representatives from both realities could meet if the paradox ever became unstable. You want me to go there? Not just you, Captain Chen. You and a carefully selected team of humans who can handle the truth. Because at the Nexus Station, you'll meet others like me, Kethmori who believe there must be a third option, a way to resolve the paradox without destroying either species. Sarah studied the princess's face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda, but all she saw was desperation tinged with hope, emotions that were hauntingly human despite the alien context. How do I know this isn't some elaborate trap? Some way for the hegemony to eliminate human leadership before we become a threat? You don't, Zarathek replied with brutal honesty. But consider the alternative. If we do nothing, the timeline will collapse within years. If the extremists on either side succeed in their plans, the result will be the same. This is the only path that offers any hope for both our species to survive. The princess moved to a secure panel in the wall and withdrew a small device that seemed to shimmer with its own internal light. This contains the location of the Nexus Station and the quantum keys needed to access it. More importantly, it contains a complete record of the Kethmori's historical archives, proof of everything I've told you. Sarah accepted the device, feeling its weight far exceed its physical mass. This small object contained the power to reshape humanity's understanding of itself and its place in the universe. There's one more thing you should know, Captain, Zarathek said as Sarah pocketed the device. The temporal distortions have revealed something our original ancestors never expected. Humanity isn't just a reflection of what the Kethmori were. You're evolving along a completely different path. What do you mean? Your species has developed capabilities that we never possessed, even at our technological peak. Your ability to form genuine emotional bonds across species barriers, your capacity for sacrifice without personal gain, your tendency to choose cooperation over domination. These aren't just cultural differences. The princess paused, her expression becoming almost reverent. They're evolutionary adaptations that the Great Transformation prevented my people from developing. In trying to become gods, the Kethmori may have sacrificed the very qualities that could have made us truly great. Sarah felt a strange mix of pride and terror. So the question isn't whether humanity will become like you, it's whether we can find a way to help you become like us. Exactly. And that, Captain Chen, is why I believe you may be our only hope. As Princess Zarathek prepared to leave, replacing her ceremonial veils and returning to her disguised form, Sarah stood at the viewing portal watching the stars. Somewhere out there, hidden in a pocket between realities, waited a space station that might hold the key to saving two civilizations. But first, she had to decide whether to trust an alien princess who claimed her people and humanity were two sides of the same impossible coin. The device in her pocket seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and Sarah made her choice. 3 days after her encounter with Princess Zarathek, Captain Sarah Chen stood in the briefing room of the human research vessel Prometheus, facing 5 individuals who represented humanity's best hope of understanding the impossible situation they now faced. She had spent those 3 days carefully reviewing personnel files, psychological profiles, and service records, looking for people who could handle a truth that would shake the foundations of human understanding. Doctor. Marcus Rodriguez, the ship's chief xenobiologist, sat at the far end of the table, his weathered hands folded over a tablet displaying genetic sequences. At 38, he had already revolutionized humanity's understanding of alien biochemistry, and had the mental flexibility to process paradigm-shifting information. Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez occupied the seat to his right, her military bearing evident even in the relaxed setting. As the ship's tactical officer, she had a reputation for thinking 3 steps ahead of any opponent and maintaining absolute composure under pressure. If this situation required military solutions, Elena would find them. Across from them sat Dr. Culper, James Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, the ship's quantum physicist and temporal mechanics specialist. His expertise would be crucial in understanding the timeline distortions Princess Zarathek had described. At 29, he was the youngest member of the team, but his work on theoretical temporal dynamics had earned respect throughout the scientific community. Engineer Chief Yuki Tanaka had drawn the seat nearest to Sarah. Her practical experience with alien technologies and her ability to integrate disparate systems into functional solutions had saved the Prometheus on more than one occasion. If they needed to interface with Kethmori technology, Yuki was their best hope. The final team member, Dr. Hunter, Aisha Okafor, sat quietly observing the others. As the ship's diplomatic specialist and cultural anthropologist, she had spent her career studying alien societies and their interaction patterns. Her insights into Kethmori behavior would be invaluable in navigating the complex political situation they were about to enter. Sarah looked at each of them in turn, knowing that what she was about to tell them would forever change their understanding of humanity's place in the galaxy. "Before we begin," Sarah said, activating the room's highest level of security protocols, "I need each of you to understand that everything discussed in this room is classified beyond any level you previously encountered. The information I'm about to share could trigger galactic war, fundamentally alter human civilization, or both." Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward, his dark eyes intense with curiosity. "Captain, with respect, we're all senior staff. We know how to handle classified information." "Not like this, Marcus." Sarah moved to the central display and activated Princess Zarathek's device. The holographic timeline materialized in the center of the room, its twisted loops and paradoxes immediately capturing everyone's attention. What you're looking at is a temporal map showing the relationship between humanity and the Kethmori Empire. What I'm about to tell you will explain why the hegemony has always treated us with such contempt, why the Galactic Council fears our expansion, and why our very existence may be the key to preventing a catastrophic collapse of space-time itself. For the next hour, Sarah recounted everything Princess Zarathek had revealed. She showed them the holographic evidence, played back audio recordings of their conversation, and presented the genetic analysis data that supported the princess's claims. As she spoke, she watched her team's expressions evolve from skepticism to amazement to profound concern. Dr. Chen was the first to speak when Sarah finished. "The mathematical implications are staggering. If the Kethmori really did manipulate the timeline to this degree, the paradox should have collapsed reality in this entire region of space." "But it didn't," Elena pointed out, her tactical mind immediately jumping to practical concerns, which means either the princess is lying or there's a stabilizing factor we don't understand. Dr. Okafor had been studying the cultural data embedded in the device. "The behavioral patterns are consistent with everything we know about Kethmori society. Their rigid hierarchies, their emphasis on genetic perfection, their apparent inability to form genuine emotional bonds with other species. It all fits with a civilization that underwent radical artificial transformation." Yuki was examining the technical specifications of the Nexus station. "This technology is decades beyond anything we've seen from the hegemony. Dimensional manipulation, temporal shielding, quantum isolation chambers. It's like they built a laboratory for studying the paradox itself." "Which brings us to the central question," Sarah said. "Do we trust Princess Zarathek enough to attempt contact with this Nexus station?" Marcus looked up from his genetic analysis. "Captain, if even half of what she's told us is true, we may not have a choice." "The temporal distortions you mentioned, I've been reviewing our long-range sensor data from the past 6 months. We've detected anomalies that match her descriptions." "What kind of anomalies?" Elena asked. "Space-time fluctuations that don't correspond to any known natural phenomena. Gravity wells that appear and disappear without associated mass. Energy readings that suggest reality itself is becoming unstable in certain regions." Dr. Chen nodded grimly. "I've noticed similar patterns in my temporal research. I thought they were measurement errors, but if there's actually a paradox causing timeline instability, then we're looking at a crisis that could affect the entire galaxy," Sarah finished. "The question is whether we trust an alien princess who claims her people and ours are evolutionary cousins, or whether we try to handle this through official channels. What official channels? Dr. Okafor asked pointedly. The Galactic Council has never taken humanity seriously as a political entity. The Earth government barely acknowledges the existence of temporal mechanics, let alone timeline paradoxes. And if there really are extremist factions working to force a resolution, we could be walking into a trap by going through normal diplomatic procedures, Alina concluded. At least with the princess's approach, we maintain operational security and the element of surprise. Yuki held up the technical specifications again. There's another factor to consider. The Nexus station appears to be equipped with technology that could advance human civilization by centuries. Even if this is some elaborate deception, the potential benefits might justify the risk. Sarah watched her team debate, noting how they instinctively began working together to analyze the problem from multiple angles. It was a distinctly human trait, this ability to form functional partnerships with individuals from completely different backgrounds and specializations. I've made my decision, Sarah announced, bringing the discussion to a halt. We're going to the Nexus station, but we're not going in blind, and we're not going unprepared. She moved to another section of the display, calling up star charts and tactical assessments. Alina, I want you to prepare contingency plans for everything from first contact protocols to combat evacuation procedures. If this is a trap, we need multiple ways out. Understood, Captain. Marcus and James, you'll work together to analyze every piece of data in that device. I want independent verification of the princess's claims wherever possible. If there are inconsistencies in her story, find them. Both scientists nodded their agreement. Yuki, you'll focus on understanding the Nexus station's technology and preparing our systems for interface with whatever we encounter there. If we need to access their computers or defend against their systems, you're our best hope. Already on it, Captain. And Aisha, you'll study everything we know about Kethmori culture and society, looking for patterns that might help us understand their true motivations. The princess seems sincere, but we need to be prepared for deception. Dr. Okafor smiled grimly. I've been thinking about that already. There's something fascinating about her behavior patterns. They're more human than any Kethmori we've ever encountered in diplomatic settings. How so? Genuine emotional responses, spontaneous gestures, even her speech patterns show flexibility that we've never observed in other members of her species. Either she's an incredibly sophisticated actress, or removing those ceremonial coverings revealed more than just her physical appearance. Elena leaned forward. You think the disguise affects their behavior? I think the disguise might be psychological as much as physical. If the Kethmori really are what humans became after artificial transformation, those ceremonial coverings might serve to suppress their original behavioral patterns. The implications of this observation settled over the team like a heavy weight. If Dr. Okafor was correct, then every interaction humanity had ever had with the Kethmori had been with artificially constrained versions of their true personalities. There's something else we need to consider. Doctor, Chen said quietly. If we're really dealing with a timeline paradox of this magnitude, our actions in the next few days could literally rewrite history. Every choice we make, every risk we take, could determine not just the fate of our species, but the fundamental nature of reality in this region of space. Sarah felt the weight of command pressing down on her like a physical force. She had led her crew through dangerous situations before. First contact scenarios, hostile alien encounters, even brush wars with space pirates. But never had the stakes been so incomprehensibly high. How long until we reach the coordinates the princess provided? She asked. Yuki consulted her engineering displays. At maximum sustainable velocity, approximately 18 hours. But Captain, I should warn you, the route takes us through the disputed zones. If the hegemony or the Galactic Council detect our course change, they'll want to know what we're investigating, Elena finished. And if there really are extremist factions monitoring humanity's development, our movement toward those coordinates might trigger their response. Sarah made a mental note to have Elena prepare additional defensive measures. The last thing they needed was to fight their way to a diplomatic meeting that might prevent galactic catastrophe. One more thing, Dr. Rodriguez said, looking up from his genetic analysis. I've been comparing human DNA samples from our crew with the Kethmori genetic markers the princess provided. The similarities are remarkable, but there's something else. What kind of something else? Humans have genetic sequences that don't appear in the Kethmori samples. Entirely new evolutionary pathways that suggest we've been developing in directions their species never explored. Dr. Okafor's eyes widened. That supports the princess's claim that humanity is evolving along a different path. But It also means we might have capabilities the Kethmori never developed, Sarah concluded, which could make us either incredibly valuable allies or incredibly dangerous enemies. The room fell silent as each team member contemplated the implications of this revelation. If humanity possessed unique evolutionary advantages, it would explain the Galactic Council's mixed fear and curiosity about human expansion. It might also explain why extremist factions would want to either eliminate humanity or force their rapid transformation. "All right, people," Sarah said, standing and moving toward the door. "You have your assignments. We reach the coordinates in 18 hours, and I want to know everything possible about what we're walking into before we get there." As the team dispersed to their various tasks, Sarah remained in the briefing room, staring at the holographic timeline that continued to loop back on itself. Princess Darenthek's revelation had answered many questions about humanity's place in the galaxy, but it had raised far more. What she did know was that her species stood at a crossroads that would determine not just their own future, but potentially the fate of an entire galactic civilization. The weight of that responsibility was staggering, but as she watched her crew move with purposeful determination to prepare for the unknown, Sarah felt a surge of distinctly human pride. Whatever challenges waited at the Nexus station, humanity would face them with courage, ingenuity, and the one quality that seemed to set them apart from their transformed cousins, the ability to hope for outcomes that transcended mere survival. The next 18 hours would test that hope to its limits. The Nexus station materialized before them like a fever dream made manifest in twisted metal and impossible geometry. Captain Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the Prometheus, watching through the main viewer as space itself seemed to bend around the alien structure. The station existed partially outside normal reality, its sections phasing in and out of visibility as they rotated through dimensions that human senses weren't equipped to perceive. "Sensor readings are completely inconsistent," Dr. Chen reported from his science station. "The structure appears to be simultaneously 3 kilometers long and 30 kilometers long, depending on which instruments we use to measure it." Chief Engineer Tanaka shook her head in amazement. "The power signatures are off the charts. Whatever's keeping this thing anchored in our reality must require more energy than our entire fleet produces." Lieutenant Commander Vasquez studied her tactical displays with growing concern. "Captain, I'm detecting at least 17 different energy signatures that could be weapon systems, but they're unlike anything in our databases. Or they could be defensive systems, docking mechanisms, or even artistic installations," Dr. Okafor added. "We have no frame of reference for interpreting Kethmori technology on this scale." Sarah watched as sections of the station continued to shift through dimensions that made her eyes water to contemplate directly. Princess Zarethic had warned her that the Nexus existed between timelines, but the reality of that existence was far more disorienting than she had expected. "Incoming transmission," Communications Officer Park announced. It's coming from multiple sources simultaneously." On screen, the main viewer flickered, and suddenly Sarah was looking at not one but 5 different figures. 3 were clearly Kethmori, though they looked subtly different from any she had encountered before. Their blue skin seemed to shimmer with internal light, and their forearms moved with an organic fluidity that contrasted sharply with the rigid formality she associated with the hegemony. The other 2 figures were shocking in their implications. They appeared completely human, but wore clothing and technology that suggested advancement far beyond current human civilization. One was a middle-aged woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. The other was a young man whose casual demeanor couldn't hide the intelligent intensity of his gaze. "Captain Chen." The silver-haired woman spoke first, her voice carrying an accent Sarah couldn't identify. "I am Dr. Elena Vasquez Prime, though I suspect you know someone with a similar name." Sarah's blood ran cold. The woman bore an unmistakable resemblance to her own tactical officer, but aged and bearing the confident bearing of someone who had lived through experiences that stretched across decades. "I'm Commander Zeth Kara," one of the Kethmori spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that were somehow gentler than those Sarah associated with the species. "We represent the Temporal Accord, representatives from multiple timeline branches who have been working to understand and stabilize the paradox." The young human man stepped forward. "I'm Dr. James Chen, but I suspect that's going to cause some confusion." He gestured towards Sarah's science officer with a wry smile. "Let's just say I'm from a timeline where humanity developed temporal mechanics a few decades earlier than yours." Sarah felt her worldview shifting again. Not only were humans and Kethmori connected across time, but there were apparently multiple versions of both species working together to prevent catastrophic timeline collapse. "How many alternate versions are we talking about?" Sarah asked. "Of your specific crew?" Dr. Vasquez Prime consulted a device that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. We've detected at least 47 variations across different timeline branches, some where humans develop more quickly, others where the Kethmori transformation never occurred, and several where both species evolved along completely different paths. Commander Zeth Kara manipulated his own controls, and the image split to show additional viewpoints from inside the Nexus station. Sarah could see vast chambers filled with beings she recognized as human and Kethmori variants, all working together on projects that defied easy description. The station exists in a pocket dimension where representatives from stable timeline branches can collaborate without causing further paradoxes, he explained. We've been studying the phenomenon for the equivalent of several centuries across multiple temporal streams. And what have you discovered? Dr. Chen asked from his position at the science station. The alternate version of himself smiled. That the universe is far more resilient and far more fragile than any of us imagined. The paradox that created our situation shouldn't be sustainable, but it is. More importantly, it appears to be intentional. Intentional? Sarah stepped closer to the viewer. You mean someone planned this? Not someone. The second Kethmori representative spoke for the first time. Something. We call it the architect. An intelligence that seems to exist outside linear time and has been manipulating events across multiple galactic civilizations. Dr. Okafor looked up sharply from her cultural analysis station. Are you talking about a godlike entity? We're talking about something that makes gods look like amateur enthusiasts, Dr. Vasquez Prime replied grimly. The temporal manipulation that created the human Kethmori paradox is just one of hundreds of similar interventions we've detected across galactic history. Sarah felt her crew's attention focus entirely on the conversation. This was far beyond what Princess Arathic had revealed. They weren't just dealing with a single temporal paradox, but with evidence of massive manipulation across multiple civilizations and timelines.
What does this architect want? Sarah asked.
That's the question we've been trying to answer, Commander Zeth Kara replied. But we've detected patterns that suggest it's conducting some form of vast experiment, creating paradoxes, observing how different species respond, then either stabilizing successful variations or allowing failed experiments to collapse. The young alternate doctor, Chen, gestured towards something off-screen, and the image shifted to show a three-dimensional map of the galaxy. Dozens of points were marked with complex symbols, each representing what appeared to be temporal intervention sites. Every major galactic civilization has experienced similar manipulations at crucial points in their development, he explained. The crystalline singers, the void princes, even the ancient progenitors who supposedly seeded life throughout this region of space, all of them show evidence of artificial timeline modifications. But humanity and the Kethmori represent the most complex paradox the architect has created, Dr. Vasquez Prime added. Two versions of the same species, developing simultaneously along different evolutionary paths, with the potential to either destroy each other or create something entirely new. Sarah exchanged glances with her crew, seeing her own mix of fascination and terror reflected in their expressions. They had come seeking answers about humanity's relationship with the Kethmori, but instead had discovered evidence of manipulation on a scale that spanned galactic civilization itself. What do you need from us? Sarah asked. Your timeline branch appears to be the focal point for the next phase of the experiment, Commander Zeth Kara explained. The temporal distortions that Princess Arathic detected are accelerating, but they're not random. Something is forcing the paradox toward resolution, and it's happening in your reality. The extremist factions she mentioned? They're real, and they're more dangerous than she knew. The alternate doctor, Chen confirmed. But they're not the primary threat. We've detected evidence that the architect itself is preparing to intervene directly. Doctor? Vasquez Prime moved closer to the viewer, her expression intense. Captain Chen, we need your crew to serve as anchors for a stabilization attempt. Your timeline represents the most balanced development pattern we've observed. Neither the Kethmori path of transformation nor the extremist human path of forced evolution. What kind of stabilization attempt? Elena asked from her tactical station. We're going to attempt something that's never been tried before, Commander Zeth Kara replied. A controlled merger of timeline branches, creating a stable reality where both species can coexist and develop naturally. And if it fails? Then this entire region of space reverts to the state it was in before any of the architect's interventions. Dr. Vasquez Prime said quietly, which means the last 50,000 years of galactic history simply Never happened. The implications of this statement settled over the bridge like a suffocating blanket. Not just human and Keth-Mori civilization, but dozens of species and countless individual lives would be retroactively erased from existence. How do we do it? Sarah asked. First, we need to bring your ship into the station's dimensional pocket, the second Keth-Mori representative explained. The process will require precise coordination between your crew and our teams here.
And second? Chief Tanaka asked.
Second, we need to convince the extremist factions that there's a better solution than forcing a violent resolution to the paradox. The young alternate, Dr. Chen, said, which means diplomatic contact with groups that have spent centuries preparing for war. Sarah looked at her crew, seeing determination mixed with fear in their expressions. They had signed up for exploration and scientific discovery, not for a mission that could literally determine the shape of reality itself. But they were here, and they were humanity's representatives in a crisis that transcended any previous challenge their species had faced. Doctor. Okafor, Sarah said, making her decision. Prepare first contact protocols for multiple unknown factions. Elena, work with your alternate to develop security arrangements that account for technology we don't understand. Everyone else, prepare for the most complex diplomatic and scientific challenge in human history. She turned back to the viewer. We're coming aboard your station, but I want full transparency about what we're walking into and what you expect from us. Agreed, Doctor. Vasquez Prime replied. Though I should warn you, once you enter the dimensional pocket, you'll be outside normal space-time. If something goes wrong, there may be no way back to your original timeline. Then we'd better make sure nothing goes wrong, Sarah replied. As the Prometheus began its approach to the impossible station, Sarah felt the weight of representing not just humanity, but potentially the balanced future that both species might achieve if they could find a path beyond the artificial constraints of the architect's experiment. The next few hours would determine whether the universe's greatest paradox would become its greatest catastrophe, or its greatest opportunity for transcendence. The interior of the Nexus station defied every assumption Sarah had ever made about space construction. Corridors curved through dimensions that shouldn't exist, creating pathways that were somehow longer on the inside than their external measurements suggested. Gravity shifted orientation depending on which surface served as the floor, and the walls themselves seemed to be constructed from materials that existed in multiple quantum states simultaneously. Captain Sarah Chen led her team through passages filled with representatives from timeline branches she was only beginning to understand. They passed humans who looked familiar, but wore technology that suggested centuries of advancement beyond anything Earth had achieved. Keth-Mori moved past them with the fluid grace Sarah had observed in Princess Zara Thek, but without the rigid formality that characterized the hegemony. Most disturbing were the hybrid beings, individuals who appeared to represent some form of merger between human and Keth-Mori characteristics. They retained the distinctive four-armed physiology, but their faces showed unmistakably human features and expressions. The convergence process has been occurring naturally in several timeline branches. Dr. Vasquez Prime explained as she led them through the central hub. When humans and Keth-Mori develop together without the artificial barriers imposed by the Great Transformation, they tend to evolve toward a synthesis of both forms. Dr. Okafor studied the hybrid beings with fascination. The cultural implications are staggering. If natural development leads to biological integration between our species, then the artificial separation maintained by the current timeline is preventing both species from reaching their full evolutionary potential. The alternate Dr. Chen finished, which may be exactly what the architect intended to study. They arrived at a vast chamber that served as the station's central conference facility. The room was designed to accommodate beings from multiple timeline branches simultaneously, with sections that existed in different dimensional phases to prevent paradox formation when alternate versions of the same individuals met. Sarah found herself looking across the room at what appeared to be a war council representing every major faction involved in the temporal crisis. On one side, she recognized Keth-Mori wearing the formal regalia of the hegemony, but their body language suggested they were extremists rather than mainstream diplomatic representatives. On the other side, humans wearing advanced military gear that incorporated technology decades beyond anything Earth currently possessed. Between them sat the balanced representative Sarah's crew had been brought to support. Humans and Keth-Mori, from timelines where both species had developed cooperatively. The situation has deteriorated since we last spoke, Commander Zethkara announced as Sarah's team took their positions. Both extremist factions have detected the temporal anomalies and are preparing to force resolution of the paradox. A Kethmori wearing elaborate ceremonial armor stepped forward from the hegemony extremist group. I am War Commander Thekvar, speaking for the Temporal Purification Coalition. We reject any proposal that maintains the existence of the human aberration. The original timeline must be restored, with the Kethmori as the sole inheritors of our evolutionary legacy. From the human extremist faction, a woman wearing powered armor covered in weapon systems responded. Colonel Martinez, Terran Temporal Liberation Front. Humanity won't accept subjugation to alien dominance. If forced resolution is inevitable, we'll ensure our species emerges as the dominant form. Sarah stepped forward, feeling the weight of representing baseline humanity in a conflict that spanned multiple realities. Captain Sarah Chen, representing the Earth Alliance timeline. We propose that forced resolution isn't inevitable. There has to be a path that preserves both species without destruction. War Commander Thekvar's forearms gestured dismissively. Impossible. The paradox grows more unstable each day. Reality itself demands correction, and correction requires the elimination of the temporal anomaly. Which timeline branch do you consider the anomaly? Sarah asked pointedly. The question is irrelevant, Colonel Martinez interjected. Both timeline branches are products of artificial manipulation. The only solution is to accelerate human development to a point where we can transcend the constraints of the original experiment. Dr. Chen looked up from his temporal analysis equipment. Colonel, the energy requirements for forced transcendence would destabilize space-time across multiple sectors. You'd destroy dozens of civilizations. Acceptable losses for species survival. Sarah felt her anger rising at the casual dismissal of billions of lives, but forced herself to remain calm. These extremists had spent centuries preparing for this conflict. Emotional appeals wouldn't change their positions. There's something none of you are considering, Dr. Vasquez Prime announced, activating a holographic display that showed the galaxy-wide pattern of architect interventions. The Kethmori transformation and the human Kethmori paradox aren't isolated events. They're part of a larger pattern that affects every major civilization in this region of space. The display zoomed in on specific intervention sites, showing how each major species had undergone similar artificial modifications at crucial points in their development. The crystalline singers were artificially enhanced to survive in vacuum environments. The void princes were modified to exist partially outside normal reality. The progenitors themselves show evidence of temporal manipulation that created their advanced biotechnology. War Commander Thekvar studied the display with growing unease. You suggest that all galactic civilization is artificial?
Not artificial. The alternative, Dr.
Chen corrected. Guided. The architect isn't creating new species. It's accelerating and directing natural evolutionary processes to achieve specific outcomes. What outcomes? Colonel Martinez demanded. We believe it's preparing for something, Commander Zethkara replied. Every modification, every paradox, every enhancement follows patterns that suggest they're components in a larger design. Sarah felt pieces of an enormous puzzle beginning to click together in her mind. The hybrid beings we saw in the corridors. The natural convergence between humans and Kethmori in balanced timeline branches. What if the architect isn't just studying our species' development? What if it's breeding us toward a specific evolutionary outcome? Dr. Okafor finished, her anthropological training helping her recognize the pattern. The room fell silent as the implications of this theory settled over the assembled representatives. If the architect was conducting a galaxy-wide breeding experiment, then every civilization, every conflict, every advancement was part of a design that spanned millions of years. That would mean the extremist factions are playing directly into its plans, Dr. Vasquez Prime observed. Forced resolution of the paradox through conflict would produce exactly the kind of evolutionary pressure the architect seems to favor. War Commander Thekvar's formal composure cracked slightly. You propose that our entire civilization is merely a component in some greater being's experiment? I propose that recognizing the manipulation is the first step toward transcending it, Sarah replied. If we can understand what the architect wants, we can choose to give it something else. Colonel Martinez laughed bitterly. And what exactly do you think it wants that we haven't already provided? Conflict? We've had wars across the galaxy for millennia. Evolution? Every species has been advancing. Transcendence? The Kethmori achieved that 50,000 years ago. Not transcendence, Sarah said, the final piece falling into place. Synthesis. She moved to the holographic display, manipulating it to show the convergence patterns observed in the balanced timeline branches. Every intervention the architect has made promotes either conflict or cooperation between species with complementary characteristics. The crystalline singers and the gas-form entities naturally form symbiotic relationships. The Void Princes and the matter-based civilizations create interdimensional trade networks. And humans and Kethmori naturally evolve toward biological and cultural integration when not artificially separated. Commander Zethkara finished. The architect isn't trying to force evolution within individual species, it's trying to force evolution between species. The implications were staggering. If Sarah's theory was correct, the goal wasn't to determine which species would survive the paradox, but to create conditions where they would merge into something greater than either could achieve alone. The hybrid beings in the corridors, Dr. Jack, Chen said excitedly. They're not just possible futures, they're the intended outcome of the experiment. War Commander Thekvar stepped back as though physically struck. Impossible. The Kethmori achieved genetic perfection through the Great Transformation. We cannot be improved through contamination with inferior genetic material. Superior and inferior are artificial distinctions, Dr. Okafor replied. Every species has evolutionary advantages that others lack. Humans developed emotional flexibility and cooperative instincts that the Kethmori transformation suppressed. The Kethmori achieved technological advancement and longevity that humans lack. Separately, both species are incomplete. Colonel Martinez was studying the hybrid beings visible through the chamber's viewing sections. You're talking about voluntary genetic merger, the surrender of human independence to alien control. I'm talking about partnership, Sarah corrected. The hybrid beings we've observed aren't dominated by either human or Kethmori characteristics. They've synthesized the best of both. She gestured toward the viewing section, where a group of hybrids was working on some complex technical project. Their forearms moved with Kethmori precision, but their facial expressions showed distinctly human creativity and emotional engagement. They have the technological capability to solve problems that would challenge either parent species individually, combined with the social flexibility to work cooperatively across multiple cultural frameworks. And that's supposed to be worth sacrificing our species' identity? Colonel Martinez asked. Is maintaining species identity worth destroying both species? Sarah countered. The debate that followed revealed the fundamental difference between the extremist and moderate factions. The extremists viewed the situation as a zero-sum competition where one side must dominate or eliminate the other. The moderates saw it as an opportunity for both species to transcend their current limitations through cooperation and eventual synthesis. There's one thing we haven't considered. Dr. Vasquez Prime announced during a brief pause in the argument. What happens if we refuse to participate in the architect's experiment entirely? Explain, War Commander Thekvar demanded. Every civilization that has undergone architect intervention shows enhanced capabilities but also increased dependence on technologies and social structures that didn't develop naturally. What if the experiment's true purpose is to identify species that can recognize the manipulation and choose their own evolutionary path? The alternate Dr. Chen nodded slowly. A test of whether intelligent species can transcend artificial guidance and achieve genuine autonomous development. Sarah felt a surge of understanding. That's why the balanced timeline branches are stable while the extremist branches remain paradoxical. The architect isn't trying to force a specific outcome. It's waiting to see which civilizations can recognize the manipulation and choose cooperation over conflict. Then our choice isn't between human dominance or Kethmori dominance, Commander Zethkara observed. It's between continuing the experiment and ending it through genuine partnership. The room fell silent as the assembled representatives contemplated this possibility. The extremists had spent centuries preparing for war, while the moderates had focused on managing paradoxes. None had considered that the solution might be to reject the architect's framework entirely. How do we prove that we've transcended the experiment? Sarah asked. By doing something the architect never expected. Dr. Jovitz fed. Dr. Jovitz. Doctor, Vasquez Prime replied. Instead of resolving the paradox through force, or managing it through compromise, we transform it into something entirely new. And suddenly Sarah knew exactly what they needed to do. Captain Sarah Chen stood at the center of the Nexus Station's primary operations chamber, surrounded by technology that existed across multiple dimensions and representatives from timeline branches that shouldn't coexist. Around her, the greatest crisis in galactic history was about to reach its resolution, one way or another. The plan they had developed was unprecedented in its scope and ambition. Instead of resolving the temporal paradox through force or accepting continued instability, they would attempt something that had never been tried: voluntary transformation of the paradox into a stable new reality that transcended the architect's original design. Temporal synchronization is holding steady, Dr. Chen reported from his position at a control station that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. All timeline branches are aligned for the convergence attempt. Across the chamber, War Commander Thekvar and Colonel Martinez stood with their respective faction representatives, having agreed to a temporary ceasefire while the unprecedented experiment proceeded. Both extremist leaders remained skeptical, but the evidence of architect manipulation had shaken their certainty enough to consider alternatives to mutual destruction. The hybrid volunteers are ready, Commander Zethkara announced. Throughout the station, individuals from timeline branches where human Cathmori synthesis had occurred naturally were prepared to serve as templates for the transformation process. Dr. Vasquez Prime checked her temporal monitoring equipment. We're detecting massive energy fluctuations from the architect's monitoring systems. It knows we're attempting something outside its experimental parameters. Good, Sarah replied. If we're going to transcend its influence, we need to do something it can't predict or control. The process they were about to attempt would merge the best aspects of both species while preserving the essential characteristics that made each unique. Unlike the artificial transformation that had created the Cathmori Empire, or the forced evolution the extremists advocated, this would be a voluntary synthesis that enhanced rather than replaced existing capabilities. All stations report ready, Chief Tanaka announced from her engineering position. Though I have to point out that we're about to attempt something that violates several fundamental laws of physics. The laws of physics have been getting violated for 50,000 years, Dr. Kapanika Tonis, Chen observed. At least this time we're doing it intentionally. Sarah looked around the chamber. One final time, seeing determination mixed with fear on every face. Human, Cathmori, and hybrid alike. They were about to make a choice that would echo across galactic civilization for millennia to come. Before we begin, she announced, her voice carrying to every representative in the chamber, I want everyone to understand what we're choosing. This isn't about human victory or Cathmori dominance. It's not about maintaining the status quo or returning to some imagined golden age. She gestured toward the viewing sections where hybrid beings could be seen working together with an efficiency and creativity that exceeded what either parent species could achieve alone. We're choosing to become something new, something that preserves the best of what we've been while opening possibilities we've never imagined. Some of you will retain your current form. Others will choose various degrees of synthesis. But all of us will be part of a civilization that the architect never anticipated and can't control. War Commander Thekvar stepped forward. And if this transformation destroys what makes us Cathmori, if we lose the achievements of 50,000 years of advancement, then we'll build new achievements that surpass anything either species has accomplished alone. Sarah replied. The choice is whether to cling to artificial limitations or embrace genuine growth. Colonel Martinez joined the discussion. You're asking us to trust alien technology with human evolution. How do we know this isn't just another form of the manipulation we're trying to escape? Because this time, we're making the choice, Dr. Okafor answered. The architect's interventions were always imposed without consent or understanding. What we're doing requires conscious decision from every participant. Dr. Peso, Vasquez Prime highlighted a critical point. The transformation is reversible for the first several generations. Anyone who finds the synthesis incompatible can return to their original form. This isn't a one-way commitment. The debate continued for another hour, but gradually the arguments shifted from whether to attempt the transformation to how best to implement it. Even the extremist representatives began to see possibilities in voluntary synthesis that forced evolution or temporal warfare couldn't provide. Initiating convergence protocol, Dr. Chen announced as the final preparations completed. All participants, please confirm your voluntary consent. Around the chamber, humans and Cathmori from dozens of timeline branches voiced their agreement to participate in the unprecedented experiment. The hybrid volunteers stepped into specially designed chambers that would allow their genetic and consciousness patterns to serve as templates for the transformation. Energy levels are approaching critical thresholds, Chief Tanaka reported. The dimensional pocket is holding steady, but we're starting to see reality fluctuations in the outer sections. The architect's monitoring systems are attempting direct intervention, Dr. Vasquez Prime observed with alarm. It's trying to force the paradox to collapse rather than allow transformation. Sarah felt a moment of terror as she realized they were now in direct opposition to an intelligence that could manipulate time itself. But around her, she saw human and Cathmori representatives standing together. having made their choice despite the risks. Override the intervention systems, she commanded. All power to convergence protocols. What happened next defied description in any language either species possessed. Reality itself seemed to inhale, drawing energy from across multiple timeline branches and focusing it into a single moment of pure creative potential. The distinction between human and Kethmori consciousness began to blur as volunteer participants from both species experienced awareness from perspectives they had never imagined. Sarah found herself simultaneously existing as her baseline human self and as versions from timeline branches where she had undergone various forms of synthesis. She experienced the enhanced analytical capabilities that came with Kethmori neural modifications while retaining the emotional flexibility that characterized human psychology. Around the chamber, she could see similar transformations occurring in volunteers who had chosen various degrees of synthesis. Some retained primarily human appearance, but gained additional limbs and enhanced cognitive capabilities. Others maintained Kethmori physiology while developing emotional ranges and social flexibility that their species had lost during the Great Transformation. Most remarkably, entirely new forms began to emerge, beings who combined characteristics from both species in ways that created capabilities neither had possessed alone. Convergent stable, Dr. Chen reported, though his voice now carried harmonics that suggested his own participation in the transformation. All timeline branches are integrating successfully. The architect's intervention has been neutralized, Dr. Vasquez Pran announced. It appears to have withdrawn its monitoring systems entirely. War Commander Thekvar, who had undergone a synthesis that preserved his military bearing while adding human emotional depth, approached Sarah with something approaching wonder in his expression. Captain Chen, I believe I understand something about our species that neither of us previously grasped. The qualities we each developed, Kethmori technological advancement and human social cooperation, they weren't competing evolutionary paths. They were complementary specializations waiting for synthesis. Colonel Martinez, who had chosen a more moderate transformation that enhanced her strategic capabilities while maintaining human appearance, nodded in agreement. The extremist positions both our factions held were based on the assumption that merger meant domination. But this is genuine partnership. Sarah looked around the chamber at beings who represented something genuinely new in galactic history, not the artificial creations of external manipulation, but the voluntary evolution of intelligences choosing their own development path. The question now, she said, is what we do with this freedom. Dr. Okafor, who had undergone synthesis that enhanced her cultural analysis capabilities while maintaining human curiosity, gestured toward displays showing the galaxy-wide pattern of architect interventions. We have the opportunity to offer the same choice to every civilization that's been subjected to artificial manipulation. Not forced transformation, but voluntary synthesis that allows each species to transcend the limitations imposed on them. And if they refuse? Commander Zeth Kara asked. Then they continue developing along their current paths but without external interference, Sarah replied. The architect's experiment is over. What happens next is up to the civilizations themselves. Over the following days, as the transformed beings established new social structures and communication protocols, the full implications of their achievement became clear. They had created something that was simultaneously the fulfillment and the transcendence of the architect's design. A synthesis that preserved individual choice while opening evolutionary possibilities that neither species could have achieved alone. Messages began arriving from across the galaxy as news of the successful transformation spread. Some civilizations expressed interest in similar voluntary synthesis projects. Others chose to maintain their current forms but welcomed the end of external manipulation. A few, like the Crystalline Singers and the Void Princes, revealed that they had been waiting millennia for someone to break free from the architect's control. Most importantly, the temporal paradoxes that had threatened galactic stability began to resolve as the universe adapted to accommodate genuine choice rather than imposed experiment. 3 months after the convergence, Sarah stood on the observation deck of what was now called Unity Station, watching as ships from dozens of civilizations arrived to establish diplomatic relations with the new synthesis civilization. She had chosen a transformation that preserved her human appearance while gaining additional cognitive capabilities and extended lifespan. Princess Zaratek, now revealed as a naturally occurring synthesis being from a timeline where the transformation had never been hidden, joined her at the viewing port. "Do you regret the choice?" the princess asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. The transformation had changed fundamental aspects of how she thought and perceived reality. She was no longer entirely human. But she was also more than human in ways that felt natural rather than artificial. I regret that it took a crisis to reveal what we could become together, she replied. But I don't regret choosing growth over stagnation, cooperation over conflict, or freedom over manipulation. Beyond the viewing port, the galaxy continued its ancient dance of star formation and planetary evolution. But now, for the first time in millions of years, the intelligent species within it were free to choose their own paths through the cosmos. The architect's experiment was over. The true adventure was just beginning. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't human or HFY dominance, but the transcendence of the artificial limitations that had constrained both species for millennia. They had chosen to become something new, not through force or manipulation, but through the most fundamentally human capability of all, the courage to hope for something better than what had come before. And in making that choice, they had proven that intelligence, cooperation, and voluntary growth could triumph over even the most sophisticated attempts at external control. The galaxy was free, and its future belonged to the civilizations that inhabited it, not to the manipulators who had sought to shape their development from the shadows. Humanity, in partnership with their transformed cousins and the growing community of synthesized beings, had finally taken their place as true citizens of the galaxy, not as subjects of some cosmic experiment, but as architects of their own destiny.